The next part of the brain we need to cover is the diencephalon. The diencephalon arises from the primary brain vesicle, the prosencephalon or the forebrain. So the prosencephalon or the forebrain gives rise to the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon gives rise to the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon is going to give rise then to the adult brain structure, the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is going to be composed of three paired structures, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So the prosencephalon or the forebrain is going to give rise to the diencephalon. So the primary brain vesicle is the prosencephalon. The secondary brain vesicle is the diencephalon. And then the adult brain structure is the diencephalon, which is composed of three paired structures, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Think of the diencephalon as the central core of the forebrain, surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. So think of the diencephalon as the central core of the forebrain, surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon is composed of three paired structures, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. First, we're going to take a look at the thalamus. The thalamus composes about 80% of the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is shown here. The thalamus is composed of two egg-shaped areas on either side of the third ventricle. So we can see that right here. So the thalamus is these two egg-shaped areas that are flanking the third ventricle. The thalamus is composed of a bunch of nuclei. Nuclei are neuron cell bodies. So these are groups of neuron cell bodies or nuclei. So this is going to be a bunch of gray matter in the brain. So the thalamus is going to be a group or a bunch of nuclei or groups of neuron cell bodies that function as the major relay station. So afferent impulses from all parts of the body, so sensory information from all parts of the body, is going to be sent up to the brain or to the central nervous system. And all of that sensory information is going to synapse with nuclei of the thalamus. So that the sensory neurons are going to synapse with the nuclei or the neuron cell bodies in the thalamus. The neurons in the thalamus are then going to relay that information to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is the major relay station. It's relaying information coming into the cerebral cortex. So it receives sensory information, it's going to sort and edit it, and then it's going to send all that sensory information to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. The second part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is named for its position underneath the thalamus. The hypothalamus exists below the thalamus, but above the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is also composed of a bunch of nuclei or a bunch of neuron cell bodies. So we've got all of these groups of neuron cell bodies up here. All of the neurons in the hypothalamus function as the main visceral control center. So the hypothalamus is our main visceral control center, or the main control center of our organs. Remember, anytime you hear visceral, think organs. So the visceral control center is going to be a bunch of neurons that are helping to control our organs. Movements of our organs are going to be involuntary movements. And remember that the involuntary nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus is our main visceral control center and functions to control the autonomic nervous system or our involuntary nervous system. So these are the general functions of the hypothalamus. So in general, our hypothalamus functions as the main visceral control center and controls the autonomic nervous system. But the hypothalamus has a bunch of specialized functions. So we have tons and tons of functions of the hypothalamus. So just to give you a brief description of some of those functions, the hypothalamus functions to control the autonomic nervous system. So with that, it's going to control involuntary movements of our organs, which is ultimately going to influence our heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. The hypothalamus is also going to function for temperature regulation. So the hypothalamus helps regulate our overall body temperature. The hypothalamus helps to regulate food intake. So it's going to regulate our feelings of hunger and satiety. It's going to help regulate our water balance and thirst. It assists in regulating our sleep-wake cycle, regulates our sex drive. It controls our pituitary gland, both the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. And it also functions as part of our limbic system, which provides us with our emotions. So tons of different functions of the hypothalamus. Overall, our hypothalamus functions as that main visceral control center and helps control our autonomic nervous system. The last part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. The epithalamus is associated with the pineal gland, and the pineal gland functions to secrete a hormone called melatonin. So one of the major functions of the epithalamus is to secrete melatonin from the pineal gland. Melatonin is a sleep-inducing signal, and so our epithalamus helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle together with the hypothalamus. So the epithalamus and the hypothalamus function to regulate our sleep-wake cycles. The epithalamus does so by secreting a hormone called melatonin from the pineal gland. The next brain structure we have to cover is the brainstem. The brainstem is composed of three regions or three structures: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem is going to arise from two primary brain vesicles. When we look at our primary brain vesicles, the brainstem is going to arise from the mesencephalon or the midbrain and the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. As we go from primary brain vesicles to secondary brain vesicles, the mesencephalon does not further constrict, and it's going to remain as the mesencephalon. As we go from rhombencephalon, this primary brain vesicle, to our secondary brain vesicles, the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain is going to constrict, and it's going to form two secondary brain vesicles, the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So the secondary brain vesicles, the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, and the myelencephalon, are going to give rise to the brainstem. The mesencephalon is going to give rise to the brainstem, the midbrain. So the mesencephalon is also called the midbrain, and it gives rise to the midbrain. So the first part of the brainstem is called the midbrain. The metencephalon is going to give rise to the second part of the brainstem, the pons. And then the myelencephalon is going to give rise to the most inferior part of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. So the brainstem arises from the mesencephalon, part of the metencephalon, and the myelencephalon. So the brainstem is shown right here. The brainstem is going to contain centers for many of our body's vital functions, or maintaining our overall homeostasis. The brainstem is also going to be an important passageway for information entering the brain and leaving the brain. So all information that enters the brain must enter through the brainstem. So it's an important passageway for information that's being relayed to and from that cerebral cortex. Additionally, the brainstem is going to be the site of nuclei or neuron cell bodies for 10 cranial nerves. Remember that our peripheral nervous system is composed of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. So the brainstem is actually going to be a connection to the peripheral nervous system, because it contains neuron cell bodies for 10 cranial nerves. The first part of the brainstem is the midbrain. The midbrain is also known as the mesencephalon. The midbrain has a couple of key structures. First, you'll notice that this duct is slicing straight through that midbrain. This is called the cerebral aqueduct, and it's going to connect our third ventricle to our fourth ventricle. So running through the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct. It connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. The next important structure in the midbrain is going to be the largest midbrain nuclei, called the corpora quadrigemina. So the largest midbrain nuclei, or groups of neuron cell bodies, are known as the corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina has these 4 dome-like protrusions. The superior protrusions are called the superior colliculi. The inferior protrusions are called the inferior colliculi. So the corpora quadrigemina is the largest midbrain nuclei, and it's composed of these 4 dome-like protrusions called the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Both the superior and the inferior colliculi have neurons that function for our reflexes. The superior colliculi are going to be groups of neurons that function as our visual reflex center. So our visual reflex center helps to coordinate head and eye movements. So the superior colliculi contains neurons that function as our visual reflex center, coordinating our head and eye movements. The inferior colliculi are part of our auditory reflex center. So these are neurons that function in an auditory relay from hearing receptors to the cortex. So the inferior colliculi is composed of neurons that function in an auditory relay from hearing receptors to the cortex. They function to provide our reflex response to sound. Another important structure is the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is going to be a bunch of pigmented nuclei. So these pigmented nuclei are going to be shown right here. These are these dark stained regions of the midbrain that are composed of neurons that contain the pigment melanin. So the substantia nigra are pigmented nuclei. So these are neuron cell bodies, or neurons that contain the pigment melanin. Melanin is a precursor for dopamine. So the substantia nigra are going to contain neurons with the neurotransmitter dopamine. These neurons are going to be functionally very similar to the basal nuclei. So they're going to function with the basal nuclei in order to control movements. Degeneration of the substantia nigra in the basal nuclei causes Parkinson's. So we can see that in a midbrain that's affected by Parkinson's, we don't have those pigmented nuclei or the substantia nigra. Therefore, we have a reduction in dopamine, and the substantia nigra function to help control our movements. And so in patients with Parkinson's, if you don't have those neurons that help function or that help control movements, we notice that patients with Parkinson's have those rapid or jerky movements, similar to what we see in Huntington's disease. So Parkinson's disease is caused by degradation of our substantia nigra. These are functionally similar to our basal nuclei, so they function to control movements. So when they're degraded or degenerated, we have a harder time controlling our movements. The last structure of the midbrain or the mesencephalon is the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles are going to be shown right here. So they almost look like Mickey Mouse ears. And the cerebral peduncles are going to contain these large pyramidal motor tracts. So in other words, these are tracts or groups of axons of those large pyramidal motor neurons. So these are relaying motor output from the primary motor cortex all the way down to the effector organs. So these large pyramidal neurons have to extend all the way down through the brainstem, and they're going to run down through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. So the cerebral peduncles are going to contain large pyramidal motor tracts, which are conveying motor output to effector organs. The second part of the brainstem is the pons. The pons is going to have two main parts. First, it's going to contain a series of tracts. It contains two important tracts. First, it's going to contain tracts that are relaying information from higher brain centers to the spinal cord. So these are axons or groups of neuron axons that are relaying information from higher brain centers down to the spinal cord. Additionally, the pons is going to contain neuron axons that are relaying information from the motor cortex to the cerebellum. So it's going to contain axons that are extending from the motor cortex to the cerebellum, and it's going to contain neuron tracts or neuron axons that are relaying information from higher brain centers down to the spinal cord. So the pons is going to be a site of many of our neuron tracts. Tracts, remember, are just groups of neuron axons. Additionally, the pons has a bunch of nuclei that function in our in respiration. So we say that the pons contains a respiratory center that's going to function with the medulla oblongata to maintain our normal rhythm of breathing. So the pons is also going to contain nuclei that function as a respiratory center. They function with the medulla oblongata to maintain our normal rhythm of breathing. The last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is going to contain neurons or nuclei that function as our autonomic nervous system reflex center for maintaining homeostasis. So the medulla oblongata is going to contain the nuclei that function as the autonomic nervous system reflex center for maintaining homeostasis. So it's going to contain neurons that function as cardiovascular centers, respiratory centers, and centers for vomiting, swallowing, and coughing. So the medulla oblongata is our autonomic nervous system reflex center. It's going to contain groups of neurons that function as cardiovascular centers, respiratory centers, and centers for vomiting, swallowing, or coughing. So anytime I'm referring to a center, I'm just referring to a group of neurons that function to control that body system. The medulla also is going to contain a series of tracts. The medulla is going to be continuous with the spinal cord inferiorly. So those large pyramidal motor tracts are going to extend down from the brainstem through the medulla oblongata into the spinal cord in order to carry that motor output to effector organs. So the medulla oblongata also contains tracts or axons. Those axons are predominantly a part of those large pyramidal motor neurons. The last brain structure we have to cover is the cerebellum. The cerebellum arises from the secondary brain vesicle, the metencephalon. However, the cerebellum is not a part of the brainstem. So the pons also arises from the metencephalon. However, the cerebellum is not going to be a part of that brainstem. The brainstem is exclusively going to be the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The cerebellum arises from the metencephalon, and it functions in the coordination of muscle activity, balance, and equilibrium. So we can see our cerebellum shown right here has this almost kind of leaf-like structure. We can also see that in this diagram. So when we cut the cerebellum in half, it has this leaf-like structure. So the cerebellum functions in coordination of muscle activity, balance, and equilibrium. So it's going to receive information about balance as well as our body's position in space. And it's going to help take that information, integrate that information with the motor output or the motor plan, so it can then properly coordinate movements and make adjustments in movements prior to that motor output being sent to effector organs. So it functions very similarly to the basal nuclei, where it's going to receive that motor plan from the premotor cortex. It's going to edit that plan, help filter out any unnecessary movements, help coordinate skeletal muscle movements, and it's going to send that edited plan back to our primary motor cortex so that the primary motor cortex can then send that plan out to those motor neurons. So again, the cerebellum is going to function very similarly to the basal nuclei. It's going to receive the motor output plan from the premotor cortex. It's going to filter out any unnecessary movements and help coordinate movements. It's then going to send that plan back up to our primary motor cortex so that the primary motor cortex can then send that motor output out to those large pyramidal motor neurons.